Today's case is one that I've wanted to do on my channel for a long time. It's a case that opened the door to a new method of forensic police work that is still very much used today. Even though I studied this case a few years ago, I was reminded of it again recently by a subscriber from South America who asked me to cover it. And of course, I was very happy to read all about the case again. However, before I ask you to all sit back and tell you that today we are going to look at a case from late 19th century Argentina, I would first like to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends. This online game has millions of players and dozens of tough bosses, but its heart and soul is its champions. And they've just introduced an entirely new playable faction. Get ready to meet Shadowkin. The Shadowkin are shrouded in mystery, hailing from the furthest reaches of the eastern continent, beyond the Brimstone Path. It is believed that they have been under the brutal heel of the Demon's Pawn for the last several hundred years. This faction is just getting started. Come meet the new arrivals in the game. One of my favourite new characters is called Jintaro, and with a sword like this, he could easily have been a suspect in many of the cases we've covered. Not to mention, one of my favourite features, his flaming helmet. I personally really like the fact that the game has something for everyone, from players versus player to boss battles and much more. Raids just hit their 2-year anniversary, with a load of anniversary events and tournaments going on right now. If you move quick, you might be able to catch some of those special events and get your hands on free gifts and rewards. On top of that, they've got some huge updates coming up later this month, including a new Doom Tower rotation with 2 tough new bosses. If you want to get a huge head start in Raid, all you have to do is hit the link in the description or scan my QR code and you'll get free epic champion Jotun, who is amazing for the Doom Tower. 100k of silver, 50 gems and 3 ancient shards. All this treasure will be waiting for you here, so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in game. But now, let's look at today's case. So now let's go to late 19th century Argentina. Francisca Rojas de Caraballo was born in 1865 in the port town of Necochea in Argentina. It is located on Argentina's Atlantic coast along the mouth of the Quequén Grande River, about 330 miles from Buenos Aires and 75 miles southwest of Mar del Plata. It was a peaceful place to grow up. Fishermen would leave the port at sunrise, and during the summer, people would visit the town and enjoy days spent on the wide sandy beach, the hot springs, or a nature trek in the forest. Francisca was a happy child. She was always polite and helpful. Her family lived in a small house, and she received a basic education. At the time, there was no effective education plan in Argentina, as it was not until a law was passed in 1884 guaranteeing universal, free and non-religious education to all children that education started to become more accessible to everyone. The country had started a period of economic expansion. Many people migrated from Europe, and as industries grew, foreign investment increased. The new period of industrialization meant more work in the larger urban areas, and workers would arrive to take advantage of the better opportunities available. Francisca, however, did not leave. She stayed in the more tranquil environment of Necochea. She married a gentleman named Ponciano Caraballo, and together they had 2 children. They lived in a house a short distance from the main town. Ponciano worked long hours, but only earned a modest income. Their marriage soon started to have difficulties, and there were rumours that Francisca had been seen on a number of occasions in the company of another gentleman. People would tell Ponciano that his wife was a bad woman, and eventually he decided to leave her. He told her that he would be living elsewhere and taking the children with him. They were 6-year-old Ponciano, named after his father, and 4-year-old Felisa. This greatly distressed Francisca, as although since the 1869 enactment of the Argentine Civil Code, where all civilians, both men and women, were considered equal, she knew that without the support of her husband, life would be very difficult for her, She asked him to reconsider, but he would not. He was still relatively young. He worked hard and had always done his best for his family. He thought that he and the children would be better off away from his wife. It was now 1892, and the country was recovering from a severe recession 2 years earlier, when GDP fell by 11%. And although now things were improving, there was still a large number of people without work, and wages were low. Francisca wondered what she would do to earn enough money to live on. On the 19th of June, Francisca's husband Ponciano went to their house. The time was just after 2 p.m. He tried to open the door, but it was stuck. This was strange. Francisca and the children should have been at home. She had not informed him that she was going out, and she knew that he would be coming at that time. It was Sunday, so most people were not working. Concerned for his children, Ponciano went to see his neighbour, a gentleman named Ramon Velasquez, and he asked him if he could assist in trying to get into the house. Senor Velasquez and Ponciano returned to the property and tried to open the door. Eventually, they were able to create an opening big enough for both gentlemen to squeeze through. The house was not very big, just a few rooms, but as they entered, neither gentleman was prepared for what they were about to find. Francisca was lying next to the door. She was bleeding from her neck. As they moved on to the bedroom, they found the children. They were both dead, and their heads had been nearly severed from their bodies. Senor Velasquez immediately summoned help, and the authorities quickly arrived. Ponciano was beside himself with grief, and although it seemed that Francisca was in need of medical attention, it was not possible for a doctor to look at her in detail, as she was hysterical. The crime scene was examined, and the police wondered what kind of person would commit such a terrible act, especially against 6-year-old Ponciano and his 4-year-old sister Felisa. Eventually, the police were able to speak to Francisca. She told them that it was her neighbour, Senor Ramon Velasquez, who had attacked her. She claimed that he had hit her with a spade, the same spade that was jamming the door. This statement, however, confused the police, as this was a gentleman who had helped Ponciano get into the house, and the door had been locked from the inside. They asked her if she was sure that he was the perpetrator of this gruesome crime. He seemed to be a very mild-mannered gentleman, and people who lived nearby had told them that he was a pleasant and kind-hearted neighbour. Francisca explained that her husband had asked Senor Velasquez to collect the children, as they were going to live apart from her after he discovered that she had been unfaithful. She said that Ponciano believed that they would be better off with him. She went on to tell the police that when Senor Velasquez arrived to collect the children, she refused to let them go. This caused an argument, and eventually he attacked her and 6-year-old Ponciano and 4-year-old Felisa. Senor Velasquez was arrested, and as news of the gruesome crime spread around the town of Necochea, it seemed that everyone believed him to be guilty. He was taken to the police station and questioned, but he insisted that he did not have anything to do with the murders of Ponciano and Felisa or the attack on Senora Caraballo. Although the police continued to interrogate him, he would not admit his guilt. Even under some of the most brutal techniques used in late 19th century Argentina to try and make a suspect admit their guilt, Senor Ramon Velasquez would not say that he had committed the crime. He kept on repeating that all he had done was help his neighbour gain access to the house. The police were not convinced and considered that Senor Velasquez was probably guilty, an opinion that seemed to be shared by most of the people of Necochea. However, when they made further investigations, witnesses came forward who confirmed that he was with them when the crime would have been committed. The police took down their statements, which all matched the statement that had been made by Senor Velasquez. They went over his statement again. The thing that stood out was that he had said that in the morning of the crime, Francisca had gone to his house and had a heated argument with his wife. He also claimed that when she left, Francisca was very angry. The police had thought that Senor Velasquez may have gone to the house following the arguments, but he had an alibi, and there was also the fact that the door had been locked from the inside. They started to wonder if the perpetrator of the crime may have been someone other than Ramon Velasquez. A week after the event, Francisca was able to be examined by the doctor. Although she was no longer in shock, she claimed not to be fully recovered due to the blow she had allegedly received to her head. However, during the examination, the doctors could not find any obvious signs of bruising. This seemed very strange, as the spade found at the crime scene was large and quite heavy. The doctors could not understand how she would not have received more severe injuries if she had been hit with it in the back and the head, as she claimed, especially if she had been hit by a strong man such as Senor Velasquez. It had also been noted that when she was found on the 19th of June, she only had a small cut. By the 8th of July, the news of the crime had reached the city of La Plata, which was nearly 300 miles away. This was the capital of the Buenos Aires province, and as the authorities were anxious to solve the crime, a more experienced police team was sent to Necochea, which was led by the very experienced Inspector Eduardo Alvarez. When Inspector Alvarez arrived in Necochea, Senor Ramon Velasquez was still in police custody. Despite very little evidence against him, he was the only suspect they had, and they were very reluctant to release him. The inspector visited the crime scene. He was anxious to look inside the house and try to ascertain what actually happened on the 19th of June. By now, 20 days had passed since Ponciano and Felisa were murdered. He wasted no time, and after his visit to the property, he again read through the statements made by Francisca Rojas de Caraballo and Ramon Velasquez. Something didn't seem right. The statement made by Senor Velasquez was corroborated by other people who were with him when the terrible crime happened. But the statement made by Francisca did not make any sense. She had very minor injuries, and the door had been locked and then reinforced by wedging a spade against it, all from inside the property. Inspector Alvarez wondered, with such little evidence, why the police had kept Senor Velasquez locked up for so long. In his statement, he said that he had heard Francisca say that her lover would not marry her as she had young children. This was very significant, and the inspector considered that maybe it was in fact the children's mother who had committed this most terrible act. The inspector returned to the house. He thought that there must be something, some piece of evidence that could resolve the case. He carefully inspected every room, paying particular attention to the children's bedroom. On the door, he noticed a dry bloodstain, which to him looked very much like a fingerprint. It had turned a dark brown colour. Inspector Alvarez instructed his men to carefully remove that part of the door, as he thought that it may prove to be important forensic evidence. In her statement, Francisca had said that she had never touched the children's bodies after they were found. So if he could prove that this was her fingerprint, it would suggest that she may have been responsible for their deaths. Fingerprints were in use at that time, but they were not used to solve crimes. Sir William Herschel is credited with being the first European to understand the value of fingerprints for identification. He documented his own fingerprints over his lifetime to prove their permanence. He was also credited with being the first person to use fingerprints in a practical manner. In the 1850s, while working as a British officer for the Indian Civil Service in the Bengal region of India, he started putting fingerprints on contracts. The potential use of fingerprints in forensic work was first proposed by Dr. Henry Faulds in 1880. Sir Francis Galton then took this work further and found that fingerprints were a unique characteristic of a person and that no two fingerprints were alike. Inspector Alvarez had a friend in La Plata named Juan Vucetich. He had emigrated to Argentina from Croatia in 1882 when he was 24 years old. At the time, Croatia formed part of the Austrian Empire. He was an anthropologist who was employed at the police headquarters in La Plata, where he was further developing Galton's fingerprint work. In March 1892, he had opened Argentina's first fingerprint bureau. Inspector Alvarez took ink fingerprints impressions from both Francisca Rojas de Caraballo and Ramon Velasquez, and he sent them to his friend for analysis. The results shocked the police and the people of Necochea, as the fingerprint on the door was identical to the inked sample provided by Francisca. The police, however, were still not sure exactly how accurate this type of forensic evidence was. Nevertheless, they presented their findings to Francisca. At first, she seemed confused, but as the police explained the methodology behind their findings, she confessed to the murders of Ponciano and Felisa. Now realizing the severity of what she had done, a very emotional Francisca explained to Inspector Alvarez that her husband had told her that he was going to leave, and this greatly distressed her, so she decided that it would be best if they all died, rather than live apart. She thought that if she killed them, and then herself, they would always be together. She completed the first part of her plan, but when it came to taking her own life, she found herself unable to do it. After this confession, more details came to light of her false statements and how she tried to frame her neighbour with her accusation that in a fit of rage he had taken a kitchen knife and attacked her and her children. Francisca was charged with murder and taken to prison, where she was extensively examined by doctors to ascertain whether or not she was insane. She would not, however, face the death penalty, as although murder was a crime punishable by death, in late 19th century Argentina, women were exempt from capital punishments. Eventually the doctors agreed that Francisca Rojas de Caraballo was indeed insane, and on the 20th of September 1894, she was taken to the Dolores Penitentiary near Mar del Plata. She stayed there until her death, many years later. The insight obtained by the police department encouraged the government to widen its research, and in 1900, the first identification cards were issued. The Vucetich method of fingerprint classification was soon adopted by police departments all over the world. Francisca Rojas de Caraballo was the first person ever to be convicted by fingerprint analysis. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case